Let's imagine there are two berries. They're both good for us. We eat them when we're hungry, but now we have influence. One of them is quite bitter and unpleasant. We ate it because we were hungry. The other one is quite sweet and quite lovely. Which one do we plant? We plant the sweet and quite lovely one, and now we're missing the nutrients from the bitter one that we chose not to plant. It's not just about Skittles. It's like that far back that we started interfering with things. And I would say that the minute that stuff started happening, that's when it became imperative to develop consciousness, because suddenly we needed to think more about things like, well, wait a minute now. I have to decide what nutrition is. Nature used to decide for me, but now because I'm influencing it, I have to make a decision. Should I eat more of this or should I eat less of that? We never needed to do that before.
Welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
Welcome to another episode of Modern Enlightenment. I have here one of my dearest friends, Eric Edmeades, who I recently came to Tallinn, Estonia to celebrate your 100th birthday with your...
I'm a total longevity specialist.
Yeah, with your new fiance, Kirsty.
Combined 100th birthday, just for clarity. Yeah.
So excited to welcome you because we've shared so much history. Among many things, you are the founder of WildFit. You are a speaker trainer. I've gone through your speaker training and I've learned so much from you. One of the things that always delights me is I've learned from you that speaking is so much about storytelling. And I've had the great pleasure of hearing so many of your stories. And last night, we were together with another friend of ours, Vishen, the founder of Mind Valley. You were sharing this very interesting tidbit of knowledge from your background as a anthropologist, or, it seems like anthropology is a deep passion of yours, just like it was for your father. And I'm wondering if you could share, because I find it so fascinating, that we live in the most bountiful time in history, and yet depression and mental illness is so prevalent in our lifetimes. 1 out of 2 Americans will have a mental illness as diagnosed in DSM-4. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on where we're at and where we need to be.
I think a lot about that, and it is a puzzle, but I think one of the things that's important to address about that is that when you first come out with the statement that we're living in, say, the most bountiful or best times or easiest times ever to be alive, many people will rebel against that statement, and they'll talk about the incredible violence that's in the world and the huge threats from natural disasters, and they'll point to all these things that are terrible in the world. And that's actually where some of the problem begins, is that, by most measures, the quality of life that the average person on earth is living today is infinitely better than it's ever been before. But we're not simply ignorant of what quality of life is like. We think we know, and we think it's worse than it is. And that's largely because, we're at a place where our media is profit-driven, and they know that the most addictive form of media is fear. So as an example, I don't know if have you seen the book Factfulness? It's just fascinating, just absolutely fascinating. And the authors that wrote it, they were doing a series of lectures in universities, and they would quiz the university students. Like, they'd give them a quiz about the conditions of life on Earth. And it was questions like, how many years does the average girl get of education relative to the 12 complete years that a boy gets these days? And then they ask them, they get 12 or 11 or 9 or 3, and, have people guess. And they were doing this in university campuses around the world, and there were a ton of other questions about natural disasters, crimes against children, all this kind of stuff. And in every case, the subjects of the test, largely the student body at universities, didn't simply get the answers wrong, but they got them worse than random wrong. They were not simply ignorant of conditions on Earth, but they were informed ignorance. They were firm in their belief that things are worse than they were. The answer, of course, is that these days on Earth, despite all the negative press about this, girls now get 11 years for every 12 years of education that boys get. We're almost at parity. Crimes against children are half of what they were in the 1970s, and yet parents are more afraid now to let their kids out to play than they ever been before. So I think that's the first thing, is that life by most measures, there are some environmental concerns, and I would argue there are some, political concerns, but generally speaking, the level of abundance, safety, security that we live with today is unlike anything that's ever existed on Earth today. And yet, as you point out, we have a tremendous mental health problem: anxiety, depression, psychotropic drug use, alcoholism, addiction, and even suicide. And I believe that is entirely down to evolutionary mismatch. We are living in an environment that we didn't evolve for, that we don't understand. We can consciously understand it, but our body doesn't understand it. Our instincts, our cravings, our neurotransmitters don't understand it. And that, I believe, is the source of our angst, of our pain, of our difficulty. And one way I think about that a lot is if you look at the lives of zoo animals, because the same thing has happened to them. I mean, you take an elephant out of the safety, or sorry, not the safety, you take an elephant out of the jeopardy of living in the Kruger National Park, where they face poachers and lions and hyenas and other elephants and bushfires and drought, and they don't have medical and they don't have dental. And you take them out of that environment and put them in a zoo where they're safe. There's no predators, food supply is regular, they have medical, they have dental. Obviously things are better for them in the zoo, only they're not. They live a fraction of the time. And that's where we're at. We're in the zoo.
I'm wondering if you could break down this term evolutionary mismatch for a bit. It seems like where we're at right now, I read somewhere that, of course, that our lives are much safer than before. Look at the bubonic plague, right, where a third of the world was decimated. Of course, our lives are better than that era, and yet we believe that we're in the most challenging or most destructive time of our lives. But given that we are much safer, like practically, than we ever were, what is that mismatch that's here?
So the idea of evolutionary mismatch theory, and at least in my, the way I would define it, is that an organism goes through the process of natural selection to optimize for the environmental conditions that it's living in. And mismatch is when the environmental conditions change at a pace more rapid than natural selection can keep up. And there's a really great example of this looking at the three of us having, dinner last night and having our conversations, somebody would not need to know us to know roughly where on the planet we come from. We know roughly where you come on the planet because of your eye color, the shape of your face, the skin color. We know where vision roughly comes from because of all those things. We evolved those traits relative to the environments we lived in. We know that I come roughly from Southern Europe. How does that come about? Well, if you come from equatorial Africa, you have unbelievably dark skin. And the reason you have unbelievably dark skin is because of the incredible abundance of sunlight. And so you develop a lot of melanin and you're protecting yourself from excessive sun exposure. But sun is also incredibly important to your health. So the further away from the equator you move, the lighter your skin becomes. And it's not just a northern hemisphere thing. People moved south in Africa. By the time they got to the very bottom of South Africa, the Hottentots and the Khoisan, those people's skin was sort of similar in color to yours. And in fact, they were so light when apartheid ended in South Africa and there was, wealth redistribution programs and social justice and what have you, the ruling parties in South Africa ruled that those people were too light to participate. It's so fascinating, but that's evolution. But the mismatch is when you now take somebody who evolved a skin color for a particular level of sunlight and move them to another part of the planet quickly. Because we didn't do that quickly. We didn't get from Africa to Norway in 2 or 3 generations. It took thousands of generations. And slowly, as we moved away from the sun, the lighter skin showed up as an advantage because it allowed better vitamin D development and immune system response and all the other benefits of the sun. But now you take that person from Norway and you put them on a jet and they can travel generational distances in an afternoon. And they can end up in the Caribbean or they can end up in Thailand. And there, now the sun is difficult for them. Equally, you take somebody from, Eritrea and put them in Norway, and the sun is difficult for them as well. That's the gap, the mismatch. The mismatch is being in an environment that is different from your evolved reality, your evolved biology, your evolved instincts, and so on. So we developed something called the EMMA project, which is Evolutionary Mismatch Assessment, which is a process people can go through to kind of look at their whole life and determine where are they experiencing this evolutionary mismatch. In their house, in their life, the way they live. And it's really fascinating. It affects every area: diet, nutrition, exercise, psychology, relationship, parenting, environment. It's around us everywhere because almost nothing about our lives now resembles the environment that we evolved for.
Right. Yeah. I get on a Zoom call and of course I wasn't able to communicate that distance in the past. And these imagined fears that we have of a future that has yet to be is what ultimately creates the anxiety that we have. And if I'm afraid that I'm not going to make enough money and therefore not be able to pay my bills, etc., like the neurochemicals that are pumping through my veins are the same as my ancestor getting chased down by a saber-toothed tiger or something.
Yeah, another way to look at that, because the future-paced fear of, oh my gosh, what if I don't make enough money and so on, that's probably more similar to, oh my gosh, is the hunting good at the moment? Am I going to be able to feed my family? But if you think in more immediate terms, you're sitting in your office and somebody brings an envelope to you and you can see that it's stamped and it says summons and it's thick and it's some legal document. Well, what your body starts doing at that point is it starts producing adrenaline and cortisol and noradrenaline to prepare you for this threat in the envelope. Now, that's incredibly functional when you're out in the wilderness and you stumble upon, an enemy or a lion or something. You need all those chemicals. They help you. They focus your intelligence on the given moment. So generally, you become less intelligent, except about the given thing that you're facing in that moment. You activate fight, flight, freeze. You start pumping blood around your body. You intensify your consumption of glucose. You become stronger, and your empathy starts to fade away a little, because the more fearful you are, the more selfish you become. And that's perfect if you're dealing with a lion. But now it's a summons, and you're producing all those same chemicals, and you're producing all the same fear and the strength and speed, and you need none of those things to read the envelope. In fact, this is the worst time for you to open that envelope, when you've got those chemicals in you. Another example would be you're driving along, you're on the 405, and suddenly the red and blues are in the back in the rearview mirror. The police are behind you. You start pumping adrenaline. You start pumping cortisol. By the way, added to the fact that the media has terrified you about being pulled over by the police, so now even more fear is kicked in. By the time you pull your car over and the policeman gets out and he just wanted to tell you your taillight was out, your heart is pumping, you've got a bit of a sweat going, and he looks at you and he goes, "Oh, you look nervous." Now there's a confrontation to be had. And it's all because our instinctual response to that circumstance is wrong.
So what do we do? I mean, do we shift environments? Do I move back to my ancestors' homelands in East Asia, or?
People often say that to me. It's like, what do you want me to do? Sell all my stuff and move back to the forest? And I'm like, well, no, because in the meantime, we are not strong enough even for that. As you know, I've spent a huge amount of time with the Hadzabe people in East Africa. And over 15 years, I've been visiting them, done embedded stays with them and so on. And what I can tell you is, look, you're a tough guy. You couldn't handle it. You could handle a visit with me. Like, we can go one day. You'll handle a day or two or three. But if I asked you to stay there for 2 weeks and live with them, and you had to hunt, go 10 to 25 miles per day just to get your basic nutrition needs met. There's no Uber Eats over there.
I could barely handle a Motel 6.
There you go, right? Like, that's part of the problem, is that, in a sense, well, look, we know if you're raising children and you coddle them and you protect them from harm and you never let them do any adventurous stuff that might hurt them, and you do everything you can to save them from the pain, what you've just done is raised a bunch of terribly weak, entitled children that won't be able to handle the real world at all. We are those entitled children, not so much because our parents did that to us, but because society has done that to us. We have an expectation of a soft bed. We have an expectation that food will be there every day, irrespective of our effort. And we are weakened by that. And so the truth is, most of us couldn't handle the environment so we're really in trouble. Only what I would suggest is we also have a phenomenal opportunity, and that is to say, if we can learn about our biology, our evolutionary biology, our evolutionary psychology, if we can learn about that, understand that from an ancestral wisdom perspective, and combine it with the phenomenal advancements that we've made in civilization and technology, then I think we can create something absolutely fantastic. But if we only do this part of the technology without understanding how it's impacting us psychologically, physiologically, and what have you, we're going to be in trouble. And we are. We have the highest rates of suicide that have ever existed. We have more people on, behavior modifying drugs than have ever happened before, more alcoholism. Why? Because we're living in this world that is alien to us, and we have to close that.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of like two variables, right? The environment and myself in that environment as the subject. And there's this saying, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. It's our relationship to the stimuli in our environment, right? If I pinch myself, I don't really feel much about this. But if a stranger or someone I didn't like were to pinch me in the exact same place, then I would resist that experience.
Yeah.
I would be unhappy about that experience. Now, the exact same nerves are getting hit, and yet, in one case, I feel neutral, in another, I don't like it. It's my relationship to that stimulus.
It's the meaning you're assessing.
Yeah, exactly. And so we can improve our environments, right? We can add more nature into where we live, where we work, where we are on a day-to-day basis, as an example. But what I'm really hearing is when we experience hardship, and there was a key word that you used, expectations, like when we are holding our expectations, right, to develop, what I'm hearing is develop mindfulness or mindful awareness and shift how we relate to that. Is that right?
Yeah, the key really is about consciousness. It's when you realize that we have a bunch of outdated instincts and we have a bunch of outdated biological routines. And the only way really to deal with that is to bring consciousness to bear. Now, the trouble is consciousness is an exhaustible resource. You can't, what percentage of the day can you be fully conscious? It's not a big percent. We run on autopilot a lot. So let's take a look at the instinct around food. We have an instinct that if we see some brightly colored fruit hanging from a tree, that we perceive that to be readily available calories that'll be good for us and full of vitamins. And we know that they're scarce because they're seasonal. And so our instincts are activated. We should eat that. Now, the food companies know this. And so that's why when you check out from the grocery store, you pass through the cash register and all the stuff that's there is sugar-laden, primary colored. It's all colored like brightly colored fruit. And it's done to trigger an instinct in you that, oh my God, this is ripe and I should grab one as I'm walking by. And so if you just run on autopilot, you're going to grab one and walk on by. And next thing you know, you're scarfing down some Skittles and you're on your way to developing whatever disease that'll come from that repeated behavior on a regular basis.
Skittleitis.
Skittleitis is the disease I was thinking about. Skittleitis. But the point is that our instincts are going to be triggered by that stuff. And so we do have to insert some consciousness and say, hold on a second now. I realize that my instinct is being fired by this, but it's not correct. I'll give you a much more, say, controversial topic about this is racism. Like, racism is fascinating. And the way racism is being dealt with today is that, well, if you have a racist thought, Austin, you're an evil person. You're a bad person for having that thought. And the minute we start from that frame, the minute we begin there, then unfortunately, we are all bad people because everyone has an instinct around people that are different from them. It's inborn. And so now we have this problem where everybody occasionally makes judgments on people quickly based on how they're dressed or what their race is or how they're speaking or whatever. And now you're a bad person if you do that. No, I wouldn't say you're a bad person. I would say is your instincts are being fired and you can bring consciousness to the equation to make it better. So here's what I mean by instinct. If you consider that today it's basically miraculous that you and I are here in Estonia. We're both here in Estonia. We don't belong here. I mean, neither of us are blonde-haired and blue-eyed and, Viking-blooded and what have you. We don't belong here.
It's way too cold here.
And it's very cold. But here's the thing. If we showed up here, say, 800 years ago, it wouldn't have gone very well for us because they would have seen us as strangers from another land and we look different and what have you. But now we show them a little book with our picture in it. And they go, yeah, come on in and let me tell you where the best restaurants are. This thing that we live with today, this ability to move around the planet with that kind, that's brand new. That's absolutely new. Most of history worked like this. You had a village and the people in that village looked like you, smelled like you, talked like you, and they were the safest people around you. The safest people were your family. And then there was the people in the village slightly less safe, and they looked a little less like you, and they sounded a little less like you than your family, but they were still fairly safe. But there's these people in the village over here, it's only 5 miles away. Those people, they looked to you and me, they looked very much like, but they know the difference. Those are the people from the other village. They look a little different. They sound a little different. They smell a tiny bit different, and they're a little bit less safe. Then there's the people from that village over there, and they're 15 miles away. We never see them. And they look a lot different than us. And they sound a lot different than us. And they smell a lot different than us. And they're bloody scary, those people. And by the way, the Khoisan and the Hadza Bushmen and stuff, if you read about their culture, they'll say that a Bushman can be out hunting. And if he comes upon another Bushman, he sees him in the distance, he'll duck behind a tree and he'll call out to him. And they call out for ancestors. They'll call out for grandparents' names. They're trying to find a common ancestor so they don't have to kill each other. Now, that's 99% of human history. It's people that looked a little different, smelled a little different, sounded a little, were bloody dangerous. So it's not racism, it's practical. It's practical to say, oh, you're a little different. You're an unknown to me. And so I'm going to have a little apprehension about that. It's simply practical. Only we don't need that practice anymore. We don't need it anymore because we've changed society. But it doesn't mean your DNA isn't going to react that way. And so now somebody has that thought. They go, oh my God, he looks a little different. He's a little different than me. They go, oh, I'm a bad person. No, you're not. You're sapient. Now you can step in and go, I know that's my instinctual reaction, but it's wrong. And I'm really glad to be here having this interview. I don't care how different you are from me because you're more the same than you are different.
It's like this evolutionary mismatch. It's almost as if earlier you used the word jeopardy, right?
Yeah.
When the elephant is in the national park, it's going from a life of jeopardy to a life of safety in the zoo. And yet that mismatch is creating, maybe for the elephant, more unhappiness, but what it results in is physical health conditions, maybe even death in the case of some certain animals. Right?
Most animals live shorter in captivity than they do in the wild.
Right. And we're very similar in that regard, right? When we are mismatched with evolution and our expectations are constantly different than what the reality is, that it can result in physical health issues, right? The body keeps a score, right? And it's almost like there's something valuable about the adverse environments that our ancestors grew up in by having to constantly deal with threats, right? And exert physically, so much more physically than we have now. You were sharing with me yesterday that on the average day when you were in the Hazab tribe, you had to run 17 miles to go hunt, which I don't think I've ever done in my life.
Unless there was a sale at the Apple store.
Yeah, exactly. But what's interesting is if you think of consciousness as a condition, maybe right now is the most adverse environment for the development of consciousness as you're sharing it, right? Because in order for someone to be conscious back then in those adverse conditions, it was quite simple, no?
No, I would argue it was unnecessary.
Unnecessary. And so it did not need to develop. But right now, I mean, mindfulness is one of the hottest topics. Like 30 years ago, if I said to you mindfulness, you'd be like, what's that? Or if I said, let's go meditate, you'd be like, why? Right? And now every hour, my Apple Watch reminds me to breathe. It's like, it's ubiquitous, this now. I'm curious what your take is on this idea of like...
It comes right from your question. You're like, well, it must have been so easy for those people, living that natural lifestyle to maintain this high level of consciousness. And I would argue that it was unnecessary for them, that their neurotransmitters evolved exactly for that environment. Anything they did to gain pleasure was good for them. Anything they did to get serotonin and dopamine was functional. It aided their survival. It aided their procreation, everything they did. And so there was no need for their consciousness to override their instincts or their decisions. Mm-hmm. But as we started moving away from that natural environment and certainly creating temptations that, say are less than ideal, we start needing consciousness. I mean, as an example, when you're a hunter-gatherer, you don't think about the future very much. You don't need to think about the future very much. You think about the future today, but you don't think a great deal about 2 years from now. And you probably never think about 2 years from now. Whereas we now have to think in those terms. We have to think in those terms because we've changed civilization substantially. Imagine 20,000 years ago, you and I are hunter-gatherers and we come back to one of our camps because we're nomadic, but we go to familiar camps when we travel, and we come back to one of the camps we were at it last year and look over and we go, Austin, that bush with the berries on it, isn't that where you and I were sitting last year? You remember? And we collected all those berries and we're eating them and throwing them over. You don't think we did this. You don't think this bush grew here because of us. And in that moment, everything changes. The minute we realize we could change the environment, everything changes. And you think it changes for the better because all of a sudden we're like, holy cow, you mean we can move the plants and we can grow them where we want them and we can grow the edible ones better? But then there's a whole bunch of things that come up. Let's imagine there are two berries. They're both good for us. We eat them when we're hungry, but now we have influence. One of them is quite bitter and unpleasant. We ate it because we were hungry. The other one is quite sweet and quite lovely. Which one do we plant? We plant the sweet and quite lovely one, and now we're missing the nutrients from the bitter one that we chose not to plant. It's that far back. It's not just about Skittles. It's like that far back that we started interfering with things. And I would say that the minute that stuff started happening, that's when it became imperative to develop consciousness, because suddenly we needed to think more about things like, well, wait a minute now, I have to decide what nutrition is. Nature used to decide for me, but now because I'm influencing it, I have to make a decision. Should I eat more of this or should I eat less of that? We never needed to do that before.
It reminds me of after an ayahuasca ceremony, I was with this individual who is a very decorated psychologist and was a Catholic priest for 20 years when he was younger, and then a Zen monk. And so by all accounts, like mental health and spiritual well-being badass, I think. And you're saying very slowly, like what we're doing here is we're healing in community and we're healing with nature, right? And I think a lot, and I speak a lot about this concept of skills and capacity. Like, do we have the skills to meet our current experience? And do we have the capacity, the internal resourcing to handle whatever we're experiencing now, right? If I had a bad night's sleep and I have a fight with my partner, and I yell, it's probably because in that moment, I didn't have the capacity to meet that. Yeah. So, when I think about changing the environment for the modern man, aka surrounding my workspace with more plants, right? Taking breaks and going hiking or something like that. Fortunately, I could do that in Colorado. I feel like it's increasing the capacity that I have because I'm making the situation easier, right? But if I'm living maybe in downtown Manhattan and there isn't a ton of nature available and people are honking and yelling at me, et cetera, like I can meet that experience but it requires more consciousness of me.
Yeah.
It requires more skill of me to do that, right? And so what do you think right now are the skills that people can cultivate and maybe the mechanisms by which they can increase their capacity to live a happier life?
So I think one of the things that I consider a lot about this is that we are effectively meaning-making machines. Stuff happens around us and we assess a meaning. And the meaning that we assess about that thing has everything to do with the way we interpret life in the world. The same event can happen for you and for me. I might assess the meaning that this is a very good thing. You might assess the meaning this is a very bad thing. Same event. We know that's a big part of it. But we think of meaning assessment largely as only being a conscious exercise. And what I would argue is that your body is making meaning assessments at an instinctual level all the time, even if your conscious mind isn't in there. So, one example is you walk into a spa and they've got, nice, beautiful music playing with water trickling sounds in the music with birdsong. And you relax and you kind of downregulate and you're like, oh, it's so nice. Why? Well, because of the relaxing music. Okay, maybe. Or what's happening is that the birdsong for millions of years was silenced by threats. In other words, you and I are out for a walk, and if the birds went quiet, it's because there was a predator nearby. And so when we hear the birds chirping, our DNA goes, okay, everything's okay. When we hear the water running and rippling, that's abundance. I mean, you have to imagine many, 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 many thousands, millions of our ancestors died from dehydration because they couldn't find water. And it's like our relationship with water is incredibly important. But now you can hear the trickling water. It's fake. It's coming from the sound system, but your DNA doesn't know that. It just hears trickling water. And so your whole system gets this feeling of safety and abundance. The birds are chirping, the sound is happening. And your body has assessed a bunch of meanings that you might not even be conscious of. And so I think that's the first thing we can do is we can close the gap by understanding how our body responds to those things and doing what we can to affect our environment. You talk about plants. Like one of the reasons I believe that plants are so nice in our living in our workspaces is that when you're in a flat grassland or you're in the desert and there are no plants around, that's scary. Plants indicate abundance. They indicate that there's water sources, likely good hunting, and so on. So here we put in our houses some plants. And, sure, we can talk about the fact that they produce oxygen and, sure. But I think the other side of it is that they make us comfortable because that was our environment. So I think I really like to start there is how can we communicate with our instincts, with our DNA, with our epigenetics to tell our systems that everything's okay. And then the better job we do of that, the easier it is for us to then start working on our consciousness for the things that still need to be adjusted for.
And I think this applies to so much more than just, where we live and how we decorate our rooms. It also applies to our relationships with people, right? Community equals tribe back in our ancestral days, right?
Yeah. So if we think about parenting these days, I feel that we've seen a big shift since the 70s, a shift of bubble wrapping our children and helicopter parenting and every kid gets a trophy and no kid left behind and so on. All of these things have their heart and they have their heart in the right place, but then there's an unintended consequence aspect to this, right? So if we look at what parenting used to be, parenting, say in a hunter-gatherer tribe, is quite literally by the village. Like, I've been with the Hadzabe people and you see kids walking around and you can spend 3 or 4 hours sitting in the camp and not know whose kid this is because the kid's walking around and this parent tells them something and that parent disciplines them about something and what have you. And it's like, they're being raised by the village. What we've now done to parents is said, hey, you know what? You're going to raise these kids on your own. And this is very new. I mean, even 3 generations ago, you often grew up in the house with your grandparents. And in fact, in many places on earth, it's still like that today. It's just for many of us, it isn't anymore. So the village was the village. Then the village became extended family. You know, your grandparents in the house. Maybe there was an uncle or an aunt around, but there was still a village. Then it was like, okay, we don't have that, but maybe you'll have a nanny or something. But the fact is, these days, a huge number of people are raising their kids by themselves.
Yep.
And worse than that, single. You know, because they divorced and now they're on their own, and you've got a single parent raising a child. This is not good. Like, it's not good. There's one way I like to think about it is my mom, when she was studying, she was getting her master's degree in social work. And so she had a lot of her social work and socialist friends around, and they would come around the house and I would have the most fascinating conversations with them. And they treated me, I was 12, 13, 14 years old, but they didn't talk to me like I was a kid. They talked to me like I was a real person. I remember once going to play baseball with them, softball. And my mom said, don't go and play with them. And I go, why? And she said, they won't slow pitch for you. They're going to play the way they normally play. That's the way it's going to be. And I'm like, well, that's what I would want, I thought. I got up to bat and the pitcher slung one in and I swung that back and I hit that ball and it hurt my whole body. I mean, it was a full pitch and I hit it. It hurt my entire body, but I hit it and I got to the base and it was real. It wasn't slow pitch, right? And they treated me like that. They were the tribe. But equally, I learned different communication dynamics with each of them. What a lot of children are doing right now is they're growing up, say, with a single mom or a single dad. They're learning that communication dynamic only. And I find that it's an evolutionary mismatch, it's a psychological mismatch, and it causes a problem. So what do we do about it? Well, we want to make sure that our kids get properly socialized. And this is fascinating in the realm of parenting, but I think it's very commonly talked about that, you know, that children that grow up without a father in their home have tougher outcomes. They're more likely to end up in the justice system. They're more likely to end up with, you know, with teenage pregnancies and drug problems and that sort of thing than children growing up with their parents together. What are we supposed to do about that? You know, because people do get divorced. How do we balance that out? And I don't know the answer, but what I do feel is that if we can learn from the way it was and bring as much of that to the present, then we're going to have a better outcome. So, you know, you take a look at our family. Like, you know, we had our big 100th birthday party and our surprise engagement party and all this sort of stuff. But look who was there. You know, Kirsty, my fiance, by the way, apparently as of 3 days ago, but she's there. Her kids are there. I'm there. Her ex-husband is there. His wife is there. We're all a family together. The kids are being raised by the village because we brought consciousness to it. Could there have been the potential for jealousy and anger and resentment and all that petty garbage? Sure, there could have been. But you know what was more important than that? The kids were more important than that. And so we have an unbelievable friendship. And those kids have, now between them, they have 4 parents and different communication models. They feel very loved. They have an incredibly, you know, when you think about attachment, they're quite securely attached. They've got these, we have to think like that, I believe.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And it's hard. Yeah. And it feels like it's getting harder and harder, right? Even geopolitically right now, nations are becoming more and more isolationist. And whereas you said 3 generations ago, there was the extended family, et cetera. Like right now, I don't even talk to my neighbors. I don't even think I know their first names, right? And I think of myself as quite a conscious fellow.
And you're fairly extroverted, like, you know, so you do talk to people fairly easily.
Yeah. And yet there is this almost existential challenge right now in that, A, I think we could be so busy, and B, like the availability of meeting people is, you know, especially digitally, is so much. Like I have thousands of people in my iPhone
friends.
Contacts. Yeah, exactly. Or thousands of people on Facebook or thousands of people on Instagram. And these are people that I don't interact with on a deeply basis enough to form such a level of safety that I would trust that individual if I had kids, like with my kid, right? And so I think we're in this crisis of connection that we know a lot of people, we meet a lot of people, and yet we aren't actually deeply connected with others.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird dynamic that the larger our populations get, in a sense, the bigger the safety bubble is, but then less safety is inside that bubble. And I'm not sure if I'm saying that very well, but I'll put it another way. In a hunter-gatherer community, a narcissist isn't going to get very far because they're going to get found out pretty quickly. They're going to get discovered and they're going to get ostracized and they're out. And there's nowhere for them to go, so they don't make it. Like, it's tough, right? And what happens now is that we have these larger population centers, and that narcissist can now move without moving. That narcissist can cycle through friends and burn through friendships and burn through job opportunities and just get the next job and move on. Where in the old days, that behavior would get them out. Now they just move. So somebody living in Manhattan, for example, could live like that their entire life and just keep cycling through different friends groups. And it's the way it is. And I think in a sense that what's kind of happened is that in that hunter-gatherer community, you know everybody so very well that there's a safety in talking to all of your neighbors. You kind of know that. In a sense, what we've done is we've made the population so big and we've created safety and social justice and order and all this kind of stuff. But inside that bubble, there's a ton of lack of safety. And we've all been through it. We've all been betrayed. We've all been stolen from. We've all been, verbally assaulted. Like we've all faced that weird stuff about civilization. And then that creates that amplifies this feeling of aloneness. And so that's the bizarre thing. We live in the most connected time in the history of ever. The possibilities for connection are better than they've ever been. And yet people are more lonely than they've ever been. And I think that's a weird thing, but partly it's not safe. Like your neighbor doesn't necessarily feel safe. And, I live in a small town on the north coast of the Dominican Republic. And we live on a beach called Kite Beach because of all the kiteboarding. And there are all the parents that live up and down that beach with the kids. And those kids are growing up in the village. Those kids are at my house one day, and then they're at the other house one day, and they're dealing with a variety of different parents all the time. And we as parents all talk with each other about our kids, and we talk about the different development levels. Like one of my friends was bringing her daughter over to play and said, hey, listen, Eric, I want you to know that she's dealing with this at the moment right now. If you have any insights about that, let me know. We're raising our kids in the village, and I think it's unbelievably valuable. Most people are now trying to or feel forced to do that in isolation. I think some of what we're seeing right now in the political world, some of what we're seeing right now in the economic world, and just in the fabric of society is that we've got a bunch of these children that have been raised in isolation and haven't been emotionally tested, and they're fragile. And, the whole idea that hard times make for tough people, make for good times, and good times make for weak people. And I think we're at a funny stage of that cycle at the moment.
Yeah, I love that you're framing it as a cycle, because I'm like in my mind visualizing a sine wave where we're navigating these paradoxes, right? That the easier life becomes, the quote unquote weaker that we get to face adversity. But maybe there is these contrarian forces, one which is consciousness, mindfulness on one hand, and the other is our external conditions and the ease of living on another, right? Like the easier living becomes, we actually need more consciousness, so that we're not constantly getting dopamine hits or addicted to dopamine hits, scrolling on our phone and chasing after the next big thing, right? Because it actually leads to a significantly less happy life than if we were just present and quiet and spacious and living in nature and easeful. And, I study a lot of Zen Buddhism, and one of the characteristics of those teachings is that there's no such thing as good or bad. It just is. And if I remove myself from the judgment of, this way of living is good or this experience is good or bad, then maybe we're just in this cycle towards like greater consciousness, greater like mindful awareness, so that we can develop the skill to be with what is more and more as we live longer, as we actually have greater practical safety, And I think about like abundance, right? Like we live in the most abundant times. To your point, you had to run 17 miles to go hunt wild boar or something with the Hazab tribe. Today, I can go to the grocery store, right, and buy meat. And this like era of the most abundant times that we ever lived in has that contrarian idea that it's also maybe one of the most unhappy times that humans have ever lived. And yet, if I don't judge the unhappiness, or I don't judge the mental illness, right, and I remove the societal effects from that, and I just look at like, well, are we also developing some of the most mindful qualities that we've ever lived in?
Yeah, I think what I said before is that for our ancestors, the development of consciousness wasn't as necessary, because consciousness, in a sense, is the ability to course correct. It's executive function. It's like, here's a good example. If you go and visit the Hadza people today and you check in with them on an executive function basis, how often are they exercising executive function? And I would say not all that often. I mean, they wake up in the morning, they're hungry, they have to go and hunt or gather. They go and they hunt, they gather, they come back, they do their thing, they light their fire. Every single thing they're doing is necessary in that moment. So there's no executive function required to do it. They don't have to use willpower. They don't have to go, I don't really feel like hunting today, because they don't have a choice, right? In fact, I asked the chief one day, I said, do you guys have depression? And of course, they don't have a word for that, so we had to define it as, do you have long-term sadness, like deep long-term sadness? And you go, yes, yeah, we do. Sometimes, we'd say when somebody dies, or, you could be sad for a long time, like 2 or 3 days. But that's a long time. And he goes, yeah. And I go, so what happens after 2 or 3 days that the sadness lifts? And he goes, you get hungry and you have to move. And of course, what we do when we get deeply sad, depressed, is we stop moving. We turn on Netflix and we just sit on the couch, and we don't move our lymphatic system. We don't move our flow. We don't activate our blood into our brain. Like, you've seen the scans of a brain, right? You sit for long enough and the brain basically just turns off. You get up and walk 20 minutes and there's like a fireworks show in there. Well, guess what? They were forced by the environment. They didn't have to use executive function. Today, if you're in a deep depression, you need executive function to get your ass off the couch and do something about it. Because otherwise you could just use Uber Eats and bring in the food. Right. So I think that's a big part of it, is that the responsibility and opportunity of the existential stuff that we're going through at the moment, like what is the purpose of our lives and why are we, the opportunity and the responsibility born from that is exactly consciousness. You don't need to develop consciousness when things are easy. When everything is happening in accordance with your instincts, when everything is happening in accordance with your biology, when your neurotransmitters are a complete match for the environmental conditions, you don't need consciousness. You don't need to force yourself to behave in a certain way. The anterior cingulate cortex, sitting inside there, gets blood flow when you do that which you should do but don't want to. And it also gets blood flow when you don't do what you really want to do because you shouldn't. And it gets blood flow when you resist your instincts, when you resist the automatic behavior. You grow this. We did at your retreat, we did the ice baths, right? It's so funny to watch the way different people go to the ice baths, right?
Totally.
But this is the way I describe the ice bath process. All the biohackers are telling you about the blood flow redirection and why it's so good for your immune response. I'm like, there's a way better reason for doing ice baths, and it's this. You have the captain and you have the crew. And the captain says to the crew, get in the water. And the crew's like, what? I am not doing that. That's insane. Do you know how cold that water is? I'm not getting. Captain's like, get in. Really? Get in. Seriously? Okay. And the crew tips one toe in and pulls it back out. Captain, this is insane. We're not doing this. And the captain says, get in the bloody water. And the crew reluctantly gets in the water. That's consciousness. That's evading your instincts. Your instincts are not to get into the hypothermic temperatured water, right? The captain says, get in. The body gets in. And the body's going, when can we get out? Not yet. When can we get out? 3 minutes. I already told you, stay in. I want to get out now. But then around about 1 minute, what happens? The body starts going, this isn't really all that bad.
Right.
And then at the 3 minute mark, the captain says, you can get out now. And what does the crew say? I don't know. Let's see if I can stay a little longer. Then the body gets out and the captain just sits there. And the crew goes, that was amazing. That was phenomenal. I feel incredible. And the captain's like, that's right. That's why you need to listen to me from time to time. That's the development of executive function. But the Hadzabe never needed that. They didn't need to do that. Life forced them to do the right thing. We need to force ourselves to do the right thing. And so we have to develop consciousness.
It reminds me of reading this, I think, philosopher back when I was in school, Kierkegaard, who asked the question, who's more happy, the pig rolling in the mud or, Mozart creating his masterpiece, right? And he posits that it's absolutely the latter because of X. I forget the exact reason, but the idea that when humans are in their creative spirit, right? When they were able to flourish and experience a different degree of joyfulness. And I feel like I've experienced that too, plant medicine, meditation, etc. And what I think of is there's a book that we have people read in Ceremonia called The Mind Illuminated, a guide to meditation. And in the preface of that book, the author John Yates says, meditating is literally the most boring thing you could possibly do in your life, right? It's sitting still and paying attention to your breath. And what can possibly be more boring than that? And the mind attempts to wander so much, and so much of the work of meditating, which years and years and years of practice, you might be able to sit still for 20 minutes to an hour without your mind wandering. Why do that? Why, quote unquote, waste our time sitting still doing that? Well, it's because it's training. It's training because we're holding attention on something that really sucks and really is challenging to hold attention on, which is similar to how you can hold attention on really challenging things in your life, like getting in ice cold water, right? And so there's this, again, this adverse condition or adverse environment for consciousness, but why is consciousness so important, you know? And I would posit like it's because the universe is aiming us towards is a higher expression of joyfulness, of creativity, of being alive than, you know, what I would argue, I haven't been to the Hazab tribe, but what I would argue that the Hazab people are experiencing, you know, it's not enough to not suffer. It's, I think about, you know, fully living.
You said earlier the expression, you know, I think you said pain is inevitable and suffering is optional, something like that. There's this old joke. It's probably politically incorrect and get us banned from YouTube, but there's a joke about, you know, two cowboys and an Indian riding, and they get lost in the wilderness somewhere in the west of America. And they've gone through all their snacks and they're hungry at this point. And they're riding along and oh, I'm so hungry, man. I could eat 4 steaks and 6 potatoes. And the other guy's like, yeah, no kidding. When we eventually get to town, I'm going to order this and I'm going to have that. And they're talking about food the whole time. They turn to their Indian friend. They're like, how about you? What are you going to get? He goes, not hungry. And, you know, this goes on for a couple of, and then finally, after 3 days of this, they get to the top of this crest and they look down and they can see a town in the valley. And they're like, oh my God, they ride down into the town. They tie off their horses and they go into the saloon and they order food and they eat everything. And the two cowboys are basically done. They're like, oh. And the Indian just keeps eating. He eats like 4 times as much as they did. And they're like, but dude, you said you weren't hungry. And he goes, back then, no food. Hungry, not smart. And there's something in that about the pain and suffering issue, right? And so it's like this idea of suffering is that it's only suffering if we aren't receiving the message and doing something about it. Otherwise, it's just pain. But it's like when we start being a victim about that, when we start, well, I am suffering, okay, that's because you're choosing to focus on this and not resolve it or worry about it and so on. And again, it's like, oh, hang on. Like I love Morgan Freeman. I saw this, I don't know if it was a part in a movie he did or something, but I just saw this quote and I just loved it. He's like, if you ask God for strength, God doesn't come along and go, boom, I bestow strength upon you. God says, you want strength? Well, here's some shit that'll help you get stronger. And that's our life. We need those things. We need things to exercise against to get stronger. And the trouble we have today is that we've made life so damn easy that people are choosing the easy path every single time. They're like, somebody's going through an emotional difficulty. They don't go meditate. They watch Netflix. Right? Or they don't go and try and resolve the problem. They go reach for chocolate. And we keep taking those shortcuts. And that, I think that's why we have to build consciousness, because consciousness is also about time perception. It's about, consciousness is like, hey, what is the consequence of this? That requires conscious thought. What is the consequence? Hey, I'm feeling bad right now, and I think this cookie could help. But what is the consequence of that? Well, this one cookie, probably not. But since I do this every day, the consequence could be diabetes or something, right? Like, so, yeah, I feel like we are in the perfect time for the development of consciousness because we've separated ourselves so heavily from nature.
Yeah. Well, this has been a very enlightening chat. And I'm just reminded that we have an obligation now to go get that pie-sized cookie in Old Town Talon.
That's so funny, you know, like, speaking of instinct, that's really interesting. If you and I were walking along in the bush and we spotted a fruit tree, no fruit on it, but we recognize the leaves, we would have a dopamine response. Oh my God, it's the fruit tree that we know about. And that emotional response would trigger memory, because that's what emotion is for. It would index the memory so that we would always know how to go and find our way back to that bush. And here we are, modern times, although walking through Old Town in Tallinn, but that's still modern times. Mm-hmm. And we see this thing. We all have a serotonin dopamine response to this crazy. If it had been normal cookies, you're like, whatever, normal cookies, but they were so special. And we created an emotional response. And now we still remember the ripening fruit on that tree and we know how to walk back to it.
Yes, I know exactly where that cookie shop is.
So fascinating. So fascinating.
I think what I'm taking away from this is that we're not so far removed from our ancestors, but what we have available to us is this path of developing our consciousness so that we can meet our current environment where it's at with greater ease, and therefore capitalize on the abundant and safe environment that we have now so that we can experience greater levels of living than our ancestors did.
If you don't use a car in accordance with its design, it will have problems. If you buy a 4x4 and you never take it 4x4ing, and then one day you try to take it 4x4ing and then you switch it into 4-wheel drive, there may be something wrong because it was not used at all. If you don't drive the car at all, it'll atrophy. It needs to be used in accordance with its design. And that's an inorganic thing, and it even applies. But we are regenerative organic, and we regenerate based on use. So if you don't use us in accordance with design, we have problems. If we don't put the right food in, we have problems. If we don't move our bodies, like I think I mentioned this example when we were talking last night. We evolved a heart and a diaphragm to pump oxygen around because oxygen is important and urgent. But lymphatic fluid is not urgent. It's only important. So we never evolved a pump for that because our daily movement forced lymph to move around our system. So we didn't need a pump. We didn't evolve a pump. But now, fast forward today, people sit at their desk 8 hours a day. They sit at Netflix 3-4 hours a day. They sit on a plane for 8 hours. They are not moving lymph at all. They're not using the car in accordance with its design. And there's a million examples like this, but I think that is why consciousness becomes important. Consciousness says, I'm going to have to ignore some of my instincts, and I'm going to have to take cues from what's going on, and I'm going to have to remold my environment in a better way so that I can feel safe and I can enjoy the abundance and the safety that we've created today. Because today, safest times ever, more anxiety than ever. Why? Well, and maybe I can kind of wrap on this point, but it's like, how many times in your life have you faced death? And I'm not talking about say a psychedelic death or, somebody cut you off in traffic. I mean, how many times have you been in a situation in your life where you have felt either you've literally had a gun to your head or something like that, where death was within 30 seconds? How many times has that happened to you?
Maybe two.
Maybe two. That would make two more than the average person. Most people will only experience death at the very end. One of the problems with that, in my opinion, is that our ancestors, like if you were to go and ask your grandparents about that, it probably happened to them annually. And if you ask their grandparents, it happened to them monthly. And if you ask their grandparents, it happened weekly. And if you ask their grandparents, it was daily. Daily death was a reality. So your adrenal system evolved for that. And that's why today we never face it. And so the smallest thing happens, like this dude cut me off in traffic and I flooded myself with adrenaline and cortisol and I wanted to kill him. This is why we need consciousness.
Well, thank you, Eric, for coming. I've learned so much in every conversation that we have, but this conversation was so fun. This pathway from our environment and our ancestors all the way to modern living and consciousness development. How can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
They can go to ericedmeades.com or they can go to gapfinder.com, where we have the Emma project, where they can actually do the evolutionary mismatch assessment, and it kind of guides them through different areas of life and measures where they are and then gives recommendations, environmental, relationship, health, food, nutrition, that kind of stuff. And so they can go to gapfinder.com to do that. And I manage my own Instagram page. If they got questions, they can find me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.